Part 1. Search. Chapter 1. Joy in my tea leaves. Despite warnings that not even the most accomplished bush pilot could find Kenya's Meru National Park headquarters on the first go, Bill had insisted he could. A pilot and zoologist whom I had met on my arrival in Africa, Bill took off from the Nairobi airport without a flight plan. So confident was he of our ability to complete a quick, uneventful, and successful journey. For half an hour, all went well. We floated over a surrealistic patchwork quilt countryside dotted with shambas, the small African homesteads, while Bill identified their owner's source of income as rice from the geometric paddies below us. Then, static doused the radio, and clouds obliterated the 17,058-foot-high Mount Kenya, somewhere on our right. Basing his decision upon the meager information he had received that the headquarters lay at the base of a jagged mound called Leopard Rock, Bill began to swoop down and buzz every hill in sight. When some bumps on the ground turned into the tents and huts of a camp, Bill exclaimed hopefully, "George Adamson's place," as he dove down across the twin-peaked outcropping, then pulled the Cessna back up and out over the plain we had been cruising. As we skimmed the tops of acacia trees, suddenly below us loomed a brand-new, well-delineated red road. Carefully avoiding the trees and crossing our fingers that the road would turn out to be the headquarters airstrip, we landed and taxied right up to the park's main gate. I don't know whether it was a customary gesture or a flustered reaction to our appearance out of the sky, but the African ranger on duty gripped his rifle and saluted. "Wapi Leopard Rock?" Bill demanded, making the sentry's already bulging eyes pop. To cover the laugh that welled up to strangle him, he cleared his throat. Pointing and gesticulating with head and hands, he tittered, "Miley and Billy! Miley and Billy! 2 miles!" In the long run, because we found Leopard Rock at the other end of the red road, it would have been simpler to have taxied there, but we reckoned that the park warden would enjoy a longer life without the shock of watching an airplane careening down his new highway. An hour later, and 12 miles deeper into the Meru Park, Bill cranked the brake of the sweltering Land Rover assigned to us by the park warden at the entrance to a compound of huts, and we swung down to zigzag along a trail that bisected the 5 palm log structures. "Hodi? Hodi? Hodi?" Bill hollered, explaining over his shoulder to me, "That means, 'May I come in?'" Like all the missionaries and explorers in every film of Africa I had ever seen, we were being watched. I could feel the eyes. Finally, behind the last hut, we found her. She'd heard our commotion. She'd seen us, too. But bent over a metal pan filled with soapy water, Joy Adamson continued to wash her hair. Squinting at the turban of foam wrapped round her head and the moisture cascading down her stoic face, I wanted to laugh at such a fitting culmination to the craziness of everything that had happened that day, but I didn't dare. "I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow," she said tersely, her greeting ringing like a reprimand. Then she shouted, "Choka!" stopping my protest that she knew I had to grab the airlift when I could get it. At Joy's summons, a tall, handsome, diffident-looking Meru appeared from the opposite end of the camp. We excused ourselves and followed him to a table, set with cold drinks, in the camp's cozy arbor of vine-covered trees and bushes on the Bwatharongi rivulet's bank. "Kind of a cool reception," Bill quipped. I nodded uneasily. Minutes later, with her short, curly, blonde-brown hair arranged in a fluffy, wispy style tied with a green cotton cord, Joy swung into the chair at the table's head. A radiant, albeit nervous, smile dashed across her strongly etched, sun-tanned face, dispelling the rigidity that had welcomed us. Although we declined her offer of tea and cake, moaning that the warden's wife had just filled us with a large meal, she thrust some orange squash at us, pointedly instructing me to dilute it to taste with water. Her blue eyes watched me intently as I followed her directions. Then she launched into a discussion with Bill about his lion work in Tanzania, but her gaze kept coming back to where I sat silently and uncomfortably. As I returned her sporadic stares, I began to understand the real reason for Joy's curt reception. She still retained a heavy Austrian accent, although since 1938 she had lived in Kenya, and her mannequin-like gait reflected Strauss waltzes far more than it did the miles she plodded each day across Africa's plains. We had thought nothing of the hair-washing encounter, but to Joy, who represented a cultural heritage at the other end of the pole from Kenya's freewheeling openness, it had been a disastrous way to greet guests. Too soon, Bill, who had to head back before darkness closed Nairobi's airport, was disappearing down the road in the borrowed Land Rover. Joy and I continued to wave at him long after he could have seen us. For a timeless moment, our arms flailed aimlessly in the air. We were waiting, avoiding the inevitable. Finally, when we dropped our arms and faced each other, I realized that, despite our friendly paper relationship, we were strangers. I didn't know what to say to her. I didn't even know what to call her. Was this awkward opening to set the tone for my whole visit, I wondered? 2 years before, in 1966, the film based on Joy's famous book, Born Free, about Elsa the lioness, had moved me deeply, and I had written a fan letter to the Adamsons. To my amazement, Joy had replied, informing me that I might like to know about a corporation for the preservation of wildlife involving a special children's penny campaign that she was setting up in the States. To Joy's letter, I had responded with pages of ideas. After we had corresponded for several months, Joy had put me in touch with her U.S. Elsa representative, who just happened to live in San Diego. I lived in West Los Angeles. Through him, I had become so involved in Joy's program that we had talked about my working as his assistant and about traveling to Africa when the corporation was officially organized. In July of 1967, we had discovered instead that the momentum had suddenly and for an indefinite time shifted back to Africa. As secretary for 9 years to the president of the film division of the International Talent Agency, MCA Artists Limited, I had been intimately involved with Hollywood. Now, at age 29, I was determined to leave the motion picture industry. I wanted to do something new, something different. I wanted to work for Joy's Elsa campaign that sooner or later, I felt certain, would become an established fundraising unit in the U.S. The following September, I had decided that on my own I could afford a 3-month trip to Africa, and I had written to Joy for permission to visit her for at least part of the time that I would spend in Kenya, beginning in January 1968. "Big welcome," she'd replied. "Now," she said, shattering our silent evaluations of one another, "I'll show you to your palace." She directed Choka, the cook, to fetch my bags, and pointing to a square structure newer than the others, she announced grandly, "Voila! You won't have to sleep in a tent after all. Doesn't that make you happy?" My experiences with tents having been limited to campfire girl outings or family trips to the mountains, I had no idea what it could be like in a tent in the middle of Africa's game country. I would have been willing to try, but in answer, I merely shrugged. "A director might come soon from Hollywood," she went on. "He'll need a place to stay, but I couldn't ask him to put up with a tent, so I had the boys build this. Oh, you'll move in with me when he comes," she teased. The boys kept wanting to know who was getting such royal treatment. I just told them it was for someone from the films. "You didn't," I protested. "Well, why not?" she countered. "Be careful what you hang up in there. No silks. Doo-doos." "Doo-doos?" "Bugs," Joy interpreted in parting, her word hitting the sultry mid-afternoon with a thud. Alone then, I examined my quarters, feeling the coolness of the green ground sheet that covered the dirt floor, and noting the shoulder-high, palm log wall that shielded a dressing area with wooden flooring, the palm log table, the palm log chair, and the mosquito-netted camp bed. It was a far cry from my cluttered, wicker-decorated apartment, but I felt at home. With relish, I set about unpacking, wondering instantly why I hadn't left the bulk of my possessions back in California. As always, I had yielded to the temptation to drag along much too much of everything, and just as I was muttering that what I needed badly had to be on the bottom of each suitcase, I heard Joy calling me. "Come on," she said as she flew by the door. "I want to go to Pippa." Dropping everything, I raced off after her. When I landed next to her, she warned, "If we find the cheetahs today, I'll ask you to stay inside the Land Rover. I haven't introduced them to strangers yet." "I understand," I puffed, out of breath from trying to keep up with her. I was aware that during the filming of Born Free, she had acquired Pippa, a pet cheetah, from a family who were moving to England. To rehabilitate Pippa to a wild state, as she and her husband George had done years before with Elsa, Joy had then set up camp in the Meru National Park. "Pessie," she shouted toward the hut farthest from her quarters. "What does that mean?" I asked, still trying to get my breath. "Hurry," she explained. Then I spotted the object of her command, an African about 5 feet 2 inches, so thin that he seemed to be skin stretched over bones. Garbed smartly in the full uniform of a park ranger, he sported a rifle over one shoulder. He did not Pessie, however. With an elaborate grin on his leathery face, he ambled toward us. "This is Kitungu," Joy said, with a softness in her voice and a twinkle in her eye that revealed a very special bond between the Austrian lady and her wizened African tracker. Later I learned that the scout's real name was Twittingru, but from Joy it never came out that way. She always pronounced it Kitungu, which in Swahili means onion. "Jambo," I greeted him, avoiding his name. "Jambo, Memsab." His bright eyes gleamed. "How old is he?" I asked Joy as we arranged ourselves on the Land Rover's hard bench and Twittinguru climbed in the back. "George has known him for years. He took care of our goats when we camped near here with Elsa and her cubs. Must be 55. I can work circles around him, though, and he knows it, so we tease about who's older than who," she smiled. While I calculated Joy's age to be something shy of 60, she snapped an imposing white plastic collar round her neck. "Oh, this," she moaned, seeing my questioning look. "I hate it, but if I drive without it, the pain is dreadful. When we were looking for Elsa's cubs in the Serengeti Park years ago, my Land Rover plunged over an embankment and my neck snapped. Several vertebrae have knitted together, so I have to wear this monstrosity. At night, the pain is so terrible I can't sleep." While I was thinking that I would use my newfound ability to concentrate that night to send Joy the concentration she needed to rest soundly, she thrust the vehicle into gear, and we headed onto the main road. I thought of what I had learned in the preceding 3 months and how it might help Joy. I had met Sylvia, a nurse who taught yoga, and out of curiosity I had enrolled in her twice-weekly lessons. As we had learned the basic yogic postures, Sylvia had directed us to concentrate. "Concentrate," I remembered her telling us. "Concentrate on the area across your shoulders. That's what this posture is for. Direct the energy there. Feel the tension melting away. Concentrate. Concentrate." The more she had repeated that word, the more I had found myself communicating with my own ultra-busy mind, forcing it to do something it didn't like or want to do at all, forcing it to concentrate, to fill itself with its own pulsating blackness. While lying that way, quietly, peacefully, often my limbs and trunk had tingled. At a point between my eyes, slightly above my nose, I had felt a throbbing, an alluring electric energy, hinting at space far beyond the familiar dimension. A few minutes later, I lost all thoughts of concentration when over the roar of the Land Rover's engine, Joy shouted back to Twittinguru, "Guliandovus!" Then, translating for me, she said, "Watch out for elephants. You never know." Elephants! I jumped at the word, a magnificent chill seizing me. I was in wild Africa. What was more, I was out searching for an animal that I had only seen in zoos. Pippa's cubs are what, 17 months old? I demanded eagerly. Having mated with a wild cheetah, Pippa had produced 4 young in August of 1966. 3 of them, all females, Mbili, 2 in Swahili, Tatu, 3, and Witi had survived. Nodding, Joy replied, "They're almost ready to go off on their own. For the past few months, Pippa has been taking them on a circuit of the park, 65 square miles, I counted recently. Believe me, we've had to travel to keep up with them. For a while now, they've settled on the plain near the main gate. I'm so afraid they'll wander beyond that. Then they'd be in the reserve where anything could happen. They might be killed by hunters or poachers." "But they can catch their own food and defend themselves, can't they?" I asked. "You wrote about how Wheatie had caught a diker when she was still young." 14 months. What a day! But I worry so about them. They're at the boundary right now, and they could cross over. I hate to think about that." Her voice trailed wistfully. "They'll be all right. Don't worry," I comforted, thinking, what a strange thing for me to say. "Eland's over there." Joy's finger jerked in their direction. "See those white patches? They're the hind ends of water bucks." "By the way," she asked, bringing my mind back to the subject, as abruptly as she had taken it away moments earlier, "did you do yoga with Sue Hawthorne?" "Beg your pardon?" I stalled, as my head spun around trying to make the transition. "Yoga," Joy repeated. "In your last letter, you wrote that you were studying yoga, and I told you to get in touch with the vets, Sue and Tony Hawthorne, when you came through Nairobi, because Sue teaches yoga, and I thought you'd have a lot in common." "Yes, I did call them. When Tony said he'd meet me in the hotel lobby, I asked how I'd recognize him. You'll like this. He told me he stood 6'5", had a beard, and seldom had to wear a carnation in his lapel." "You called him Tony?" Joy asked haughtily. "I guess so," I answered, surprised, picturing the doctor professor who, 12 years before, had established the University of East Africa's medical faculty, and whose pioneer research had led to the discovery of drugs for immobilizing and capturing wild animals. "I don't really remember. I think of him as Tony, or Dr. Tony. Why?" "I've known the Hawthornes for several years, but I still find it hard to call them by their first names." She punched the last 3 words. "In Europe, we use titles, not like you Americans." "I don't think that has anything to do with being American," I said defensively. "Anyway, thanks to you, we had a lovely evening. I met Bill there, too." Then the Hawthornes insisted that I stay the next night with them. I couldn't believe it. Usually it takes me a while to feel comfortable in a strange home, but theirs wasn't strange. We knew each other. "What about the yoga?" Joy persisted. "Sue's still teaching, isn't she? She tried to show me yoga once, but gave up. Said I talked too much. I couldn't concentrate." There wasn't time for yoga. I thought of Sue's busy career as a veterinarian and author, a career that blended so uniquely with Tony's. The popular TV series, Daktari, had been based upon many of the Hawthornes' case histories. On an impulse, I smiled at Joy. "Maybe we can do some postures." Without reacting to my suggestion, she continued to probe. "Did you enjoy your meals with them?" "I did, yes. You mean because they're vegetarians?" She nodded. "We never discussed it," I admitted, amazed. At that point, Joy veered the Land Rover toward the side of the road, perilously close to a gully, and stopped, bringing the subject to a close as we concentrated on our search for Pippa. Immediately, Twittenguru sprang out of the back end, his sandaled feet under spindly legs that were swathed in puttees. Like a beachcomber, he prowled the track, studying the ground for cheetah spoors. After pounding out a tattoo on the horn, her private signal to the cheetahs, Joy grabbed her binoculars and jumped onto the hood. For long moments, her straight legs obscuring my view, she took in the surrounding terrain. There was no sign of the cheetahs. We then drove farther along to repeat the procedure. When yet again, very near the main gate, she tried her strategy to no avail, Joy decided to discontinue the search, lamenting as she tossed her khaki hat back onto the car seat. "It's late, and I was mainly interested to know where they are. I don't know what I'll do if they've left the park." A certain surprise at Joy's concern for her wild cheetahs darted in and out of my mind as we returned to camp in comparative silence. We had only had time to hang up the cameras when another battered Land Rover pickup drew to a halt in the shade beside Joy's. "George!" Joy hooted with delight as she flew off to greet him. George Adamson had continued to study lions when Joy began working with Pippa. Because in their natural state, lions and cheetahs rarely mix, in 1966 George had set up his compound, wire enclosed to keep the lions out, 15 miles to the south of Joy's camp. 3 of the born-free lions, Ugas, boy and girl, had joined him there, and shortly thereafter he had accepted an additional 4 cubs. In the intervening years, George had molded the disparate animals, along with the 2 cubs girl had produced, into a single pride, a feat never before accomplished by man. From the spot by the side of my hut where I had stopped to wait excitedly for the 2, I could see that George actually stood not much higher than Joy, although his thin legs, supporting a large torso, made him appear taller. The short-sleeved green safari jacket and green shorts he wore revealed a freckled complexion. Beneath a shock of unruly, sandy gray hair, 2 roguish blue eyes punctuated George's ruddy face with its meticulously trimmed goatee. Then, shoulder to shoulder, the famous couple approached, Joy's hands rooted in her pockets. "Did you bring some meat for the cheetahs, George?" I heard her ask anxiously. "A little, Joy. I don't have much myself." "I haven't any," Joy fussed, "and I must have meat. Pippa's by the main gate, and I'm worried sick that the cubs will stray out of the park." They had reached the spot where I was standing, and Joy interrupted her pleas for meat long enough to introduce me. "George, this is Netta Pfeifer. I told you she was coming out to help with the Elsa campaign." "Hello," George smiled, his shyness reflecting a quiet stubbornness that was as penetrating in George as it was erratic in Joy. His manner also revealed that he was as reticent as Joy was volatile, as outwardly relaxed as she was high-strung, and as uncomplicated as she was complex in her demands on life, herself, and everyone around her. Cutting short my silent evaluations of my host and hostess, Joy shepherded George and me into the camp's patio by the rivulet and urged us to help ourselves to afternoon tea. "Did you find the lions today?" Joy asked, ladling generous spoonfuls of sugar into George's cup. "Yes," he replied quietly. "They killed a buffalo." "Couldn't you get some of that meat?" "No, Joy," he sighed. "I couldn't. And I couldn't bring much of what I do have because I have to save it for Ugas. You see," George explained, swinging toward me, "Ugas is always off looking for a mate, usually in someone else's territory. It wouldn't surprise me in the least that he'd gotten into another fight. He wasn't with the others on the buffalo kill, and he'll be hungry," he looked back at Joy, "when he shows up." An enormous pride in his tone forced me to realize what an unusual accomplishment the buffalo kill had been. There was equal concern, too, for Ugas, obviously George's wayward favorite. "What kind of meat did you bring?" Joy persisted. "Zebra." "Good. Pippa likes that." Together they headed for the Land Rover to fetch the much-discussed meat. I felt uncomfortable having been privy to their disagreement, but my uneasiness vanished as I heard Joy calling to me. "It's a miracle! I don't believe it! George remembered my birthday!" The closer she came, the higher her vocalizing rose. "Look at my beautiful present," she declared, holding up a small table painted black, hand-fashioned out of a 4-gallon kerosene can, with 4 tree-limbed legs and a heavy cardboard top. George grinned as he came up behind her. "Wait," he said, reaching into his bulging pocket. "I have something else." A wooden mallet and several jumbo-sized nails splattered onto the table. "What are those for?" I had to ask. "Joy's milk tins," he confided in mock exasperation. "Every time I try to pour out of one, nothing. I decided it was high time to do something about the pinhead holes she pokes in the lids." "George," Joy pouted, "you know I hate doo-doos in the milk. That's what happens when you poke such big holes in your tins. But I do appreciate the table," she relented femininely. Soon after, as a wake of dust shrouded George's departing Land Rover, Joy dumped onto the table an armload of cheese, crackers, garlic salami, butter, and some apples from the store hut we had raided on our way back from bidding George adieu. "Will you be satisfied with this? I generally have a light dinner, and I don't ask the cook to get it because I like to relax for a while outside in the evening." "That's plenty for me," I told her, pulling camp chairs to either side of the table, under the great tamarind tree by the studio hut. "What are you thinking?" she asked perfunctorily, in the middle of a bite of apple. "Nothing," I lied. I didn't know how to explain that I had been thinking of Born Free, and how I had interpreted it to mean that people, like the unfortunate lioness Elsa, become trapped by a well-meaning but stifling possessiveness that we call love. Love, I had felt, and wanted to prove, must transcend that strangling, restricting attitude, the attitude that had bound me from childhood on to an unusually heavy burden of family responsibilities. Joy's poignant account of the Adamsons' struggles to detach themselves from Elsa had made me think that they had learned just such a love, and in the process had liberated both the lioness and themselves. I had journeyed to Africa not only in connection with the fundraising campaign, but also in the hope that Joy could show me the same path to freedom that I was certain she had found through detaching herself from Elsa, then Pippa. I was expecting Joy to set me free, too. "Listen," she whispered. "Hear that? Have you ever heard anything like it before?" I definitely hadn't, and I shook my head as she continued. "That pride just moved into this territory. How I love that sound. Sim-ba-ba-ba-ba. It reminds me of Elsa." Counterpointing the lion's resonant woofs were anonymous grunts, barks, and snorts that sounded, at one moment close, then far away. The wind rustled the trees, the grass, the brush, now here, now there, flitting so stealthily that I couldn't follow its whims. As new to me and strange as the cacophony was, I felt no fear of Africa's nightly awakening. Only a calm, a new secureness surrounded me in that loud mosaic that was the silence of Africa. "Sim-ba-ba-ba-ba," Joy was intoning. Then, returning from her memories, she asked, "Would you like your bath first?" "You go ahead," I suggested, not knowing exactly where I was to bathe. "I'd like to sit here in the dark for a while." "I'll light the gas lamp in the studio for you if you want to read or something," she offered. "No, really, no thank you. I'm fine," I said softly, glad to sink into the hand-hewn palm log chair, to think of nothing but the inner and outer blackness. Without my concentrating, it was there. When I finally did step into the water-filled canvas square that sat on a platform in a secluded corner behind Joy's hut, and adjusted to the novelty of bathing unprotected by walls, ceiling, or door, I looked up at the stars. More than I had glimpsed in my whole life blazed in that African sky, and, like a ripe, golden fruit, the moon begged to be plucked. Then I peered into the lighted studio hut. In nightgown and old, gray-checkered safari robe, with plain, plastic-rimmed glasses poised on her nose, Joy was bent over some letters. Whenever I think of that camp, I remember it and Joy like that, at night, with the one gas lamp, the only light on earth. After my luxurious bath and a visit to my hut, I returned to the studio. "Joy," I announced, "I brought some things for you." Her eyes bored a hole through me before she finally said, "That's the first time you've called me by name." "I know. I didn't know what to call you. All of a sudden it seemed all right to call you Joy. Hope you don't mind." "No," she conceded, "but I'm glad you waited. People take such liberties. They show up in camp, and the next thing I know, they're slapping me on the back and calling me Joy, as though they've known me all their lives. I resent that. I'm too old-fashioned about certain things. I'm glad you didn't do that, too. I was almost afraid you might, but you didn't." "Happy birthday," I laughed, relieved, handing her gifts from friends back home who had known of my trip. A handsome turquoise bracelet made by a Navajo silversmith, the first present that Joy unwrapped, elicited oohs and ahs from us both. The second gift turned out to be a flashlight pen, whose enclosed card, indicating that nothing could be more ideal for all the work she did at night, sent Joy into spasms of laughter. I laughed, too, and on that merry note we said good night, and went our separate ways. Fumbling under the mosquito netting after Joy and I had parted, I sandwiched myself between the sheets and blankets wrapped tightly round a raft-like mattress. For a few moments I lay there listening to the trees, the wind, the animals, and watching Africa's shadows. Then my mind drifted back to my promise that afternoon to send my thoughts to Joy to help her get a good night's rest. Concentrating, I wished for Joy a deep sleep, a peaceful, refreshing, uninterrupted sleep.